From here, the earth is a marble of blue and white. Beautiful, yes, but you can't see the fences. You can see the lines drawn by fear, by politics. Yet, the ghost of those lines echoes all the way out here, in the afterlife. I'm Neil Armstrong, and tonight we listen to the voices of a shadow war, Vietnam.
From down there, those lines felt like everything. We tried to smudge them out, to imagine no countries, to just give peace a chance.
The only line I saw was between me and the wire, between living and dying. We were supposed to be building the future, but all we were doing was fighting the dirt.
Fighting the dirt, perhaps. But that dirt is ours. And the line you spoke of, Mr. Armstrong, was drawn not by fear, but by the demand of self-determination. After 1,000 years, we would not be divided again.
A powerful demand, Ho Chi Minh, but history isn't written on a blank slate. The promise we made to South Vietnam was a promise to the free world, a dam against the tide of global communism. We had to draw the line there.
The lines are in the mind. The divisions are illusions that create suffering. My purpose was to show the leaders the consequences of their political lines written in the body and soul of the people.
Consequence we live every day. They called us Viet Cong, an insult. We were the thousand resistance. The ghost in the tunnels, we were fighting for the whole, undivided nation.
The concept of an undivided nation was the great casualty of 1954. After the French defeat, the Geneva Accords created a temporary division, temporary until a free election. Ho Chi Minh, why did that crucial vote never happen?
Because the outcome was unacceptable to Washington. They knew that a free vote across all of Vietnam, North and South, would overwhelmingly elect our government. They feared the will of the people.
It wasn't the man we feared, but the system he represented. To allow a communist takeover via the ballot box would have been a catastrophic failure of the containment policy. We moved to support the anti-communist regime of No Dinh Diem.
And that's where the wheels came off, sir. Diem was a mess, corrupt, hated by the Buddhists, hated by the own people. Supporting him is what created the Viet Cong resistance. It gave them the argument.
The support for Diem's regime deepened the initial wound, turning a civil conflict into an international crisis. President Kennedy, the U.S. involvement under your administration grew from simply advising to actively participating. What was the mechanism of that escalation?
We didn't send soldiers for conquest. We sent military advisors to train the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN. It was about giving them the tools for self-defense. By the time of my death, we had around 16,000 advisors on the ground. It was an investment in the containment doctrine.
Advisors who told the ARBN where to bomb and where to patrol. You gave the Diem regime everything it needed to oppress its people. Every U.S. rifle, every helicopter fueled the resistance.
The advice was taken with violence. The Diem regime's persecution of the Buddhist majority, the pagoda raids, the arrest exposed the moral bankruptcy of the support government. The suffering was a warning to the world.
Sir, when that monk set himself on fire, the photos, that was the moment it stopped being abstract politics. It was real. It was hell. We saw it back home, too.
The tragic witnessing of Quang Duc's self-immolation occurred in June 1963. A few months later, the American political landscape shifted. The escalation then accelerated violently with the Gulf of Tonkin incident under President Johnson. leading to the Gulf of Tonkin Revolution.
The resolution, passed after the alleged attacks, essentially gave the executive branch carte blanche for full military engagement. That's when the nature of the war fundamentally changed.
Carte blanche for mass destruction. That's when the bombing started Operation Rolling Thunder. You traded a few advisors for an air force dropping more bombs on a tiny country than all the bombs dropped in all of World War II. The scale was insane, man.
They fought a conventional war against a spirit they could not see. They used P-52s and chemical agents like Agent Orange to erase the forest. But you cannot bomb a people's desire for unity out of existence.
We had to use something. The enemy was invisible. They were ghosts. You couldn't tell a farmer from a fighter. That's why we used search and destroy, clear the village, find the enemy, get out. It was a chaos.
Chaos you brought upon us. Our tactic was simple: guerrilla warfare, ambush, surprise, retreat. We fought from the earth, from our tunnels vast networks where we lived, communicated, and launched attacks. We bled you slowly.
The war, therefore, became a tragic contrast. The overwhelming industrial might of the USA versus the unyielding, intimate, and often invisible resistance of the Soviet, Cong, and the North Vietnamese army. A clash of tactics that defined the next decade of suffering. The military objectives of the USA were often defined by overwhelming power. The goal was attrition to simply kill or capture enough enemy soldiers until North Vietnam could no longer fight. But in the dense jungle, the sheer scale of the American military machine found itself frustrated by an opponent who refused to stand still. Walter W. Heisenberg tells us the reality of the search and destroy mission.
Search and destroy was a lie we were told ourselves. It wasn't finding and fighting, it was walking and waiting, waiting for a tripwire, waiting for a hidden spike, waiting for a grenade. We had land in a village, torch the house, maybe find a weapons mage, maybe just find fighting women and kids. Then we had leave and they had be back the next day. The whole point felt like burning calories, not winning ground.
The difference between us and you was the dirt. You came to dirt, we came from it. While your helicopters landed, we were disappearing into our tunnel networks, the Cuchi, the Iron Triangle, miles and miles of underground life. You bombed the canopy. We were waiting beneath the roots.
Your technology was marvelous, Mr. Armstrong. Your bombs were devastating. But the gorilla is the fish, and the people are the water. Our strategy was not simply military, it was political. We focused on winning the loyalty of the local population, making sure the American soldier could not find no safe haven, no ally, no rest.
When we faced with an enemy that is deliberately invisible and melts back into the civilian population, conventional rules of engagement break down. The military response felt it had to target the environment itself.
And that's your justification for the poison using Agent Orange? I mean, come on, man. It wasn't about clearing a field of fire. It was about killing the forest. Defoliant napalm weapons designed not just to kill, but to defile the land itself for generations. We saw the pictures of the children. That chemical warfare was a betrayal of everything American valued.
The tactics of the attrition and chemical warfare did little to break the will of the Viet Cong or the North. In fact, by late 1967, the U.S. command was reporting significant gains. General Westmoreland assured the American public that the end was in sight. The enemy was on its last legs. The public had been led to believe that containment was succeeding, but the stage had been set for a profound, shocking lie to be exposed.
We were getting ready for the Tet holiday, New Year's trust, a ceasefire. We had seen a few quiet weeks. We thought that we were finally getting a break.
We were not on our last legs. We were cowling. We had spent months infiltrating major cities, hiding weapons, preparing the biggest coordinated offensive of the entire war. The moment of truth was about to arrive.
On January 30, 1968, the invisible enemy appeared everywhere at once. The Tet Offensive was not a victory for Hanoi, but it was the point of no return for Americans' confidence. January 3rd, 1968. The Tet Offensive, a moment when officially certainly collapsed into public shock. The attacks were massive, coordinated strikes on over 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam, including the American Embassy compound in Saigon. Leslie Chow, what was the objective of such dramatic, risky maneuver?
The objective was political and psychological. The US and Saigon kept telling the people that the Viet Cong were finished. We used the new year, a moment when the enemy's word was down, to prove they were lying. We demonstrated that we could strike anywhere, anytime, even the heart of the capital. We wanted the urban population to rise up and join us.
I was stationed near a Hue. The fighting was street to street, something we were never trained for. We were fighting in the citadel, in pagodas, in places where civilians were hiding. It was savage. The sheer shock of it, we had been told we were winning. That enemy was defeated. They hit us on TV, right on the news. It felt like a punch to the gut.
The strategic losses for the communist forces were heavy. They suffered immense casualties. The expected popular uprising never materialized. Militarily, it was a costly failure for the Viet Cong.
But, Mr. President, you focus only on the tactical map. The Tet Offensive was a master stroke of political warfare. Our goal was to break the will of the American people, not simply to defeat your army on the battlefield, and that we accomplished.
And that brings us to the pivot point, the American home front. Before Tet, the US media generally supported the war effort. After the shock of the attacks, an unprecedented voice of doubt emerged, famously embodied by CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite.
Cronkite, man. He was the most trusted man in America. When he went to Vietnam, saw the rubble, and came back to say on national TV that the war was a stalemate, unwinnable, a bloody draw. That's when the conversation ended. The government's credibility was shot.
When we heard Cronkite say that, it didn't feel like the journalism. It felt like a surrender. You're out there bleeding, and the guy back home who tells everyone the truth is telling them it's all for nothing. It just fed the feeling of betrayal.
The military outcome was a communist defeat, but the psychological outcome was a decisive American defeat. Tet was the point where the vast American public, led by the media, stopped asking, "Are we winning?" and started asking, "Why are we here?" This capitalism immediately fueled the anti-war movement, giving it moral and political authority. The betrayal felt on the battlefield. The sudden collapse of faith back home, this created a political vacuum. Lyndon Johnson, the president, who escalated the war to its maximum height, announced shortly after the Tet Offensive that he would not seek re-election. The anti-war movement, now involved by the establishment's failure, exploded. John Lemon, You embodied the counterculture. What fueled the massive protests and demonstrations?
It wasn't just political disagreement, man. It was moral and generational rupture. The draft was the fuse. Young guys were being forced to die for a lie, and the system was rigged. If you were poor, if you were black, you were on the front lines. The wealthy, the educated, they got deferments. It was institutional inequality dressed up as patriotism.
He's right. Look at the numbers. African Americans made up a disproportionate number of frontline troops. They were fighting for democracy abroad when they were denied basic rights back home. It was impossible to ignore the hypocrisy. It made every step in the jungle feel heavier.
The moral argument resonates globally. When your own people question the purpose of the war, when the cost in young lives and the destruction in our nation is so vast, the original reason, the enter of containment, simply burns away. The opposition challenged the fundamental purpose of the fight.
The credibility gap opened by Ted was soon widened by a horror that shattered the global reputation of the US military. In March 1968, in the village of My Lai, American troops committed an atrocity that remained covered up for nearly 2 years.
Malay, we all knew something had happened. Rumors were everywhere, but the cover-up, that's what made it worse. We were told we were heroes, fighting for freedom. Then you learn that hundreds of unarmed civilians, women, children, old men, were executed by American soldiers. It stole every single uniform.
This was the reality of search and destroy for the villagers. When you cannot discuss the enemy, every civilian is a potential threat. They were not fighting soldiers, they were massacring the innocent. This fueled our support. It proved we were fighting a morally bankrupt invasion.
The revelation of the My Lai truth in late 1969 and the subsequent trial of Lieutenant William Coley completed the transformation of the public opinion. The question of why are we here turned into what have we become? This profound crisis of conscience drove the 1968 election, which ushered in a new president with the mandate to end the war, Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon won the president in 1968 on a promise to end the war and achieve peace with honor. This demanded a fundamental change in strategy, shifting the responsibility for the conflict from American forces back to the South Vietnamese. This policy was known as the Vietnamization. Kennedy, can you articulate the inherent risks of this policy?
The risk was whether the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, could truly stand alone. We spent years building them up, but their reliance on a massive US air support and logistics was total. Vietnamization was a tactic admission that containment had failed, the way it was executed. And now we were betting on a shaky client to achieve political outcome the US military couldn't force.
From the Grant's perspective, Vietnam meant we were finally leaving, but it felt like a betrayal of the ARVN guys we had fought alongside. We were handing them out our equipment and telling them good luck against the enemy we couldn't beat. It was a slow, deliberate retreat, not a victory.
Nixon's strategy was destined to fail. The ARVN was a creation of foreign support, not a genuine movement of the people. They had no Ho Chi Minh, no unifying ideology beyond opposition to the North. We simply had to wait, a temporary setback in the face of our historical inevitability.
Yet, As U.S. troops began to withdraw, Nixon simultaneously escalated the war in secret, hoping to force Hanoi back to the negotiation table. This involved the massive covert bombing of Cambodia and Laos to strike at the supply lines known as the Ho Chi Minh Trial. Leslie Chow described the trial importance to the North.
The Ho Chi Minh Trail was the lifeline. It was not a single path, but a vast, complex web of roads, paths, tunnels, and river crossings that ran through neutral Laos and Cambodia. It was how we moved supplies, weapons, and our troops thought. You bombed it endlessly, but we repaired it endlessly. It proved that no bomb, no matter how large, could cut the resolve of the Vietnamese people.
The secret escalation into Cambodia and Laos ignited the last major wave of anti-war protests back home. The war was supposed to be ending, but suddenly we were bombing neutral nations. This led to the strategy at Kent State, where the National Guard fired an unarmed student protesters, 4 dead in Ohio. The war was literally killing Americans both there and here.
The expansion of the war into neighboring countries, despite the promised withdrawal, demonstrated the administration's deep contradiction. They sought peace, but felt compelled to pursue one final military push. The stage was set for the final, difficult negotiations that would lead to the formal U.S. exit. By 1970, the war had become a complex tangle of simultaneous actions. Withdrawal from the U.S. ground troops under the Vietnamization, covert escalation through bombing in Cambodia and Laos, and the beginning of the endgame peace negotiation in Paris. John Lemon, the anti-war movement, had essentially forced Nixon's hands into seeking a conclusion. But did anyone on the home front truly trust his methods?
Trust? No. Nixon promised peace with honor, but we saw the honor in Kent State, and we saw the peace in the bombs dropping on Phnom Penh. His strategy was to withdraw our guys, but replace them with air power and massive shipments of guns to Saigon. It felt he was trying to create a decent interval between our exit and the inevitable collapse, so he wouldn't get the blame.
The peace with honor phrase was political necessity. Nixon had to exit the war without giving the appearance of failure, which would have had devastating consequences for the global containment strategy. The negotiations were agonizingly slow, conducted largely by Henry Kissinger and led Doug Lowe. The U.S. objective was simple: secure the return of American prisoners of war and ensure the survival of South Vietnam for some period of time.
The negotiations were a facade, masking the true military reality. We were willing to talk, but our core demand never wavered: unconditional withdrawal of all U.S. forces and their political support for Saigon. Your negotiating leverage decreased with every boatload of troops you sent home.
The talks repeatedly stalled in a desperate attempt to break the deadlock and compel North Vietnam to agree to terms. Nixon launched 2 major brutal bombing campaigns, first in 1972, and then the infamous Christmas bombing campaign, a massive series of air raids over Hanoi and Haiphong in December 1972. Quang Duc, how was that suscitated aerial assault viewed by the Vietnamese people?
It was pure suffering. The bomb fell on our cities, on homes, on the hospitals. It was a final terror response of violence by a superpower unwilling to accept the political outcomes. But violence, even on that scale, does not break the spirit of people dedicated to unite it. It only strengthens the memory of the aggressors.
We all felt that final bombing was too much. After 4 years of withdrawal, why start leveling cities again? It didn't look like an attempt to win, it looked like an attempt to punish. It was hard to reconcile that violence with the idea of honor.
Despite the controversies of bombing campaigns, the two sides returned to the table. By early 1973, the framework for an end to direct U.S. military involvement was finally in place, culminating in the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. The war was ending for America, but not for Vietnam. January 27, 1973. The Paris Peace Accords are formally signed. For the United States, this was the official, if not triumphant, end. The agreement stipulated the withdrawal of all remaining U.S. troops and the release of all American prisoners of war. For the soldiers returning home, Walter W. Heisenberg, what was the reception like, compared to the heroic welcomes of earlier wars?
There was no trick-or-treat parade. The country was so fractured by the war pro-war, anti-war, that we came home to silence, or worse, to contempt. We were the living symbols of a lost war and a national failure. We just wanted to forget, but the protests, the scorn, it made healing impossible. We were told we were fighting for freedom, then threatened like billions.
Man, I wish we could go back and tell those soldiers that our anger was with the governments, with the system, not with the guys who had to fight. The veterans deserved respect, not hostility. But the chaos of the time meant the uniform became the symbol of the state's violence, and that was terribly unfair to those who wore it.
The political priority was to close the chapter. The return of the pause, a key stipulation of the Accords, was heavily publicized to provide a semblance of peace with honor. It was a moment of necessary national relief, designed to distract from the central reality. The U.S. was leaving its South Vietnamese ally to an uncertain fate.
Indeed, the Accords established a ceasefire and technically allowed North Vietnamese troops to remain in the South. Ho Chi Minh, was there ever any intention on your side to honor the ceasefire for long?
Well, the Accords were a means to an end. The essential goal, the unification of Vietnam, was non-negotiable and historically ordained. The moment the last American plane left the country, the political agreement collapsed. It became a straight fight between two Vietnamese armies.
The war for us did not end in 1973. It only changed phase. It became a race between the ability of the ARBN to stand on its own feet and our ability to reorganize and launch the final, decisive campaign.
The distant interval John mentioned was short-lived without U.S. combat forces. The lifeline of massive American air and logistical support was severed. The stage was set for the final 2 years of fighting, leading to the ultimate conclusion in 1975. With American forces gone, the true test for Vietnamization began. The U.S. had poured billions of dollars into keeping the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the RBN, with model tanks, aircraft, and weapons. They were fighting on home ground, but without the ultimate security blanket of American air power and tactical planning. Kennedy, the U.S. commitment to containment in the Southwest Asia, was now entirely dependent on the RBN's performance. Was the South truly ready to defend itself?
The South was fundamentally unstable. The regimes we supported, like Diem's, never achieved the popular legitimacy necessary to inspire national defense. the ARVN was highly dependent on US and command structures. When we pulled out our officers and our air support, that infrastructure crumbled. The will to fight for a regime that many view as corrupt was simply not as strong as the North wills to achieve unification.
We understood this weakness. The North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong were not fighting for a salary of foreign aid. We were fighting for the whole undivided nation, as promised in 1954. The Paris Accords gave us a time to move more troops and equipment down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. By 1974, we were stronger than ever, ready for the final push.
Well, it was a cruel thing to watch from back home. The ARVN was a professional army, but they fought a static war, protecting cities and bases. The North Vietnamese fought a maneuver war, cutting supply lines, encircling units, and taking the initiative. Without us there to bail them out, their fixed positions became easy targets.
The U.S. Congress, responding to the massive disillusionment of the American public, was reluctant to send any further aid despite Nixon's assurance to Saigon. This meant the flow of replacement parts and ammunition began to dry up. John Lemon, what was the feeling in the U.S. as the reality of the South's precarious position became clear?
It was a relief. First and foremost, the war was over for America, but there was also a pervasive sense of shame of having betrayed an ally. People were tired, man. After the Watergate scandal destroyed Nixon's presidency, there was absolutely no political appetite to send one more time or one more life back to the swamp. We paid enough.
The ultimate failure of containment was that it was based on military force, not on the political needs of people. Once the force was removed, the natural course of the nation reasserted itself. The pain of the war was terrible, but the desire for peace and unity was always stronger than any foreign ideology.
The stage was set for the final, swift collapse. Without fuel, spare parts, or U.S. resolve, the South Vietnamese military began to disintegrate under the North-determined final offensive in early 1975. The ultimate failure of the U.S. policy was now just a matter of time. The spring of 1975 saw the inevitable conclusion of the Long War. The North Vietnamese offensive, launched with decisive force, met crumbling resistance, a series of tragic defeats, stirring in the Central Highlands, turned into a rapid and chaotic rout for the South Vietnamese army. Leslie Chow described the feeling of that final advance towards Saigon.
It was a sense of destiny fulfilled. After decades of fighting, after the Geneva Accords we betrayed, after the bombs and the chemicals, we saw the end. The ARVN dissolved, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked a cause. The North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong became an unstoppable wave, reclaiming the land. We knew we were just days away from annihilating the country.
And that's how the Vietnamese War ended. Thank you for listening.